Imagine waking up one morning to find a strange package on your doorstep. An unexpected parcel, a surprise to kickstart your day. Now, let's step into the shoes of Mrs. Thompson, our protagonist. Mrs. Thompson was an elderly woman, living alone in a quiet town, her days filled with solitude and silence. Her only companions were the chirping birds and the rustling leaves, yet these could not fill the void her late husband had left behind. One chilly morning, as the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow on the dew-kissed grass, Mrs. Thompson discovered something unusual on her doorstep. A box, a small, unassuming package sat there waiting to be discovered. Her curiosity piqued, Mrs. Thompson bent down to examine the mysterious delivery. As she lifted the lid, a soft mew filled the air, and out peeked a small, fluffy kitten, its wide eyes filled with curiosity and fear. Attached to the box was a note, written in a hurried scrawl, "Please take care of me." The sight of the tiny creature, so vulnerable and alone, stirred something within Mrs. Thompson. It was as if fate had delivered her a small bundle of joy to drive away her loneliness. With a soft smile, Mrs. Thompson gently picked up the kitten, cradling it in her arms. Its fur was as soft as a cloud, and its purring immediately filled the quiet house. The loneliness that had previously filled her home seemed to dissipate, replaced by the sounds of tiny paws padding on the wooden floors and the occasional meow. She decided to name her new companion Fluffy, a name that seemed to perfectly fit the tiny furball. Fluffy quickly became the center of Mrs. Thompson's world. The two were inseparable, sharing meals, watching television together, and even sleeping side by side. The house was no longer a place of solitude, but a home filled with warmth and companionship. And so, Fluffy the kitten found a new home with Mrs. Thompson, a home filled with love, care, and the promise of many shared moments in the days to come. As days turned into weeks, a bond formed between Mrs. Thompson and Fluffy. A connection that was as unexpected as it was delightful. This wasn't just a story of a lady and her kitten, it was a tale of rediscovery, of friendship, and of the transformative power of kindness. Mrs. Thompson, once a recluse, found herself enchanted by Fluffy's playful antics. The kitten's boundless energy and curiosity breathed new life into her quiet home. The pitter-patter of tiny paws echoed through the hallways, filling the silence that had once been deafening. The once empty house now resonated with the soft purrs and playful meows of the feline. Each morning, Mrs. Thompson would wake up to find Fluffy nestled at her feet, the kitten's soft purring a comforting lullaby that eased her into the day. Each night they would curl up on the couch, Fluffy's tiny form snuggled against her as she read her favorite books. Those moments of shared silence, of mutual companionship, were priceless. They were moments that reminded Mrs. Thompson of the joy and simple pleasures, of the beauty and unexpected friendships. But Fluffy's presence did more than just fill Mrs. Thompson's home with joy. It sparked a change in her, a desire to venture out more. She found herself taking frequent trips to the pet store, buying toys and treats for her new friend. She started interacting with her neighbors, something she hadn't done in years. Conversations that started with Fluffy soon expanded to other topics, slowly weaving Mrs. Thompson back into the social fabric of her community. Fluffy, in her tiny kittenish way, had managed to do something incredible. She had not only brought joy into Mrs. Thompson's life, but had also helped her reconnect with the world outside her home. She had rekindled a spirit of adventure in Mrs. Thompson, a spirit that had lain dormant for years. In a way, Fluffy had given Mrs. Thompson a new lease on life. And as our story continues, we'll see just how profound this bond between a woman and her kitten can be. But then, one day, Fluffy disappeared. It was a day like any other, but the cheerful chirping of birds outside seemed to mock Mrs. Thompson's growing sense of dread. Fluffy, her loyal and loving companion, was nowhere to be found. The house echoed with a silence that was reminiscent of the days before Fluffy's arrival. It was a silence that Mrs. Thompson had forgotten, one that she had hoped never to encounter again. Mrs. Thompson's heart pounded as she searched every nook and cranny of her small home. She called out Fluffy's name, her voice echoing through the empty rooms, but there was no answering meow, no soft padding of tiny paws. Fluffy had vanished, and with her, the warmth she brought into Mrs. Thompson's life. The worry was gnawing at her. She reached out to her neighbors, her voice quivering as she asked if they had seen Fluffy. She walked the streets, pasting missing posters on every lamppost, every bulletin board, her heart sinking with each passing hour. Her steps took her to the local animal shelter, her last hope. But the sympathetic shake of the shelter worker's head told her all she needed to know. Fluffy was not there. The days turned into nights, and the nights into days, but Fluffy remained missing. Mrs. Thompson's once lively home was now a monument to her loneliness. The laughter and joy that Fluffy brought into her life seemed like distant memories. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence, a constant reminder of her solitude. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of the leaves outside her window, each gust of wind seemed to whisper Fluffy's name. Her heart ached with the longing for her companion. The emptiness of the house seemed to grow with each passing moment, expanding until it filled every corner, every room. For the first time in a long time, Mrs. Thompson's house felt empty again. It was as if the walls were closing in on her, the loneliness creeping back like a shadow in the night. Fluffy's disappearance had left a void in her life that nothing seemed to fill. Just when Mrs. Thompson had lost all hope, something unexpected happened. On a quiet afternoon, as the sun began to lower and cast long shadows across Mrs. Thompson's empty living room, a faint, familiar sound echoed through the silence. It was a meow, soft but insistent, coming from the backyard. Her heart fluttered with a mix of hope and apprehension as she followed the sound, not daring to believe what it might mean. Her heart pounded as she pushed open the back door, the cool breeze carrying the meow closer. And there, nestled in a corner of the garden under the old oak tree, was Fluffy. But she wasn't alone. Beside her were 3 tiny, adorable kittens, their eyes barely open, their tiny bodies nestled against their mother for warmth. Mrs. Thompson was taken aback, her eyes welling up with tears. The package that had arrived on her doorstep all those weeks ago wasn't just a kitten, it was a soon-to-be mother cat. Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but laugh as the irony of it all hit her. She'd been so preoccupied with her own loneliness that she hadn't noticed the signs. Fluffy's increased appetite, her restlessness, her protective nature, it all made sense now. She scooped up the kittens gently one by one, cradling them in her arms as she carried them inside. She made a cozy space for Fluffy and her new family in the corner of her living room, next to the warm fireplace. Fluffy looked up at her, her green eyes full of trust and gratitude, as if she understood that she was home, truly home. And just like that, Mrs. Thompson's house was filled with life once again. Not with the sound of her own laughter or the chatter of guests, but with the soft purrs of a contented cat and the mewling of her kittens. Her loneliness had been replaced with a sense of purpose, a responsibility towards these 4 little lives. And in that moment, Mrs. Thompson realized that sometimes, kindness is rewarded in the most unexpected of ways. Life had a strange way of coming full circle for Mrs. Thompson. She began her journey as a lonely woman, her days filled with silence and her nights with an echoing emptiness. But when Fluffy came into her life, it was as if a burst of sunshine had pierced through her cloudy days. In her kindness, Mrs. Thompson had given Fluffy a home, a safe haven where the little cat could grow and thrive. She had provided Fluffy with love, warmth, and the promise of a family. And in return, Fluffy had given her a reason to wake up every morning, a purpose that made her days meaningful. But that's the thing about kindness, isn't it? It's like a boomerang. You throw it out into the world and it comes back to you, often in ways you could never have anticipated. Mrs. Thompson's act of kindness towards Fluffy had returned to her tenfold, transforming her life in ways she could never have imagined. She was no longer the lonely old woman who watched the world go by from her window. She was now a happy cat mom, her days filled with Fluffy's antics, and her nights with the comforting purr of her feline companion. Her world, once silent and empty, was now filled with the soft patting of Fluffy's paws, the jingle of his collar, and the gentle rhythmic purr that vibrated through the quiet of her home. This story, dear friends, serves as a poignant reminder about the power of kindness. It reminds us that no act of kindness, no matter how small, ever goes unnoticed. It has the ability to change lives, to turn the ordinary into the extraordinary, and to transform loneliness into companionship. Kindness, like a ripple in a pond, can spread outwards, touching lives and creating a wave of positive change. In the end, it wasn't Mrs. Thompson who had saved Fluffy, but Fluffy who had saved Mrs. Thompson.